Good morning. I think we ought to just go ahead and take advantage of the gift of time and begin, because I think if we don't, our time will quickly vanish on us. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Jim Quigley, the CEO of Deloitte, and I have the privilege of moderating this panel. I've been asked by WEF to just position our discussion today as part of the overall global redesign initiative that is underway, and WEF working to try to identify some threads that we can weave through greater international cooperation and help us deal with some of the very significant issues that we see in front of us as a world, and as we work to continue to become ever more effective and what we can do to try to, quote, improve the world as we move through this redesign, rethink, and rebuild. Our session today is going to focus on values, and I want to just position that by making a couple of points here as we begin. First of all, as the global CEO of Deloitte, I travel what I sometimes feel is unmercifully, and I spend lots of time with business executives, and I spend lots of time with the media and other political leaders. And as a US-based executive traveling, a very frequent discussion over the past year has been, what caused this Great Recession? How did we get to where we are? And that discussion then progresses in somewhat of a natural way to, we had a credit crisis, and that led to a financial crisis, and that led to the Great Recession. And then the blame game sometimes begins, and people want to talk about the bankers or the rating agencies or investors or the governance process, boards of directors or management teams. And when you finish that discussion, what oftentimes happens is you just simply resolve in the direction of part of the root cause analysis is this idea of values, or the lack thereof, by all of these actors on the stage. And so with this financial crisis, there's plenty of blame to go around. And what we want to do as a panel, and how I want to try to position our discussion, is not to continue the blame game, and not to try to, with a root cause analysis, find some player we can come at, but rather, let's come at the notion of values, and how can we develop the idea of values as we look forward. And so what I've challenged our panelists to do is let's have a forward look, rather than doing an autopsy on the Great Recession. Let's look forward. What is it that we can do to try to prevent a recurrence of those events? And then, interestingly to me, WEF conducted a panel, a web-based panel, 130,000 participants, and also reaffirming this notion of values. More than two-thirds of the participants in that WEF-based survey indicated that they believe that not only do we have a financial crisis, but they also believe it was a crisis of values. And so for our panel then, we're going to try to develop a couple of questions. First, what values need rethinking in the wake of the Great Recession? And then secondly, how can we translate those values into action to reduce the likelihood that we have a recurrence of these events? And so I'm going to now just introduce our panel quickly, and then I will move to each of the panelists as we develop those two questions. First of all, starting over on the far side, Yvan Allaire, who's the chairman of the board of directors of the Institute for Governance and Public and Private Organizations in Canada, and he's also a professor of strategy at MIT and at other European universities. And then we have Tom Glocer, who's the CEO of Thomson Reuters, and then Yasuchika Hasegawa, who is the CEO of Takeda Pharmaceuticals in Japan, Hartmut Ostrowski, excuse me, Hartmut, I apologize for that, the chairman and CEO of Bertelsmann. And then we've got Jim Wallis, who's the editor-in-chief and chief executive officer of Sojourners USA, which is a Christian social justice organization, and he's a well-published author, including a recent book, Rediscovering Values. And then finally, I told Mohammed that if you have a Nobel Prize winner on the stage, you have to introduce him last, and we have to go to him last, otherwise no one wants to listen to anyone else. But Mohammed Yunus, who is a pioneer in microfinance, the managing director of Grameen Bank, and the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2006. So let me now turn to Yvan, if you would please, and this broad question: what values do we need to rethink in the wake of the Great Recession?
Thank you, Jim. There's a Chinese proverb that says, one who knows he has enough is rich. And whenever I try that sentence out, I am often told, well, one never has enough, or someone else has more, so therefore I don't have enough. I think what happened over the last several years, we've built a system of incentives and motivation that overwhelm the value system. And ethics is really the resistance of values under pressure. But eventually, there is a breaking point. Heroes and saints will do what's right, whatever the cost and consequences for them. But most mortals, mes semblables, mes frères, dirait Baudelaire, are suspended in a web of meaning and motives and incentives that we ourselves have spun. I think we must understand this web and spin a new one. There is something special about this panel. I'm surrounded here by representatives of very successful organizations, a banking cooperative, a professional partnership, a faith-based and transformational organization, a large family-owned company, a publicly listed corporation with a stable network of shareholders, a publicly listed corporation with a controlling shareholder. As I'm sure my fellow panelists will testify, in all these organizations, values of trust and loyalty and a long-term perspective are alive and well. But who is missing on this panel? Precisely the most prevalent type of corporation in several countries. Stock exchange listed, owned by hundreds of ever-changing, transient funds, many with short-term performance goals, bunch of share flippers. By the way, the average holding period for shares on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ is now around 7 months. They're governed by directors who are totally independent, but often lack legitimacy and credibility. They're managed by a mobile executive class motivated by stock options and other compensation to work exclusively for these short-term investors. And these companies are surrounded by speculators, hedge funds, financial operators, free to play all sorts of lucrative games with the companies and shares, and debt. These are the model corporations of our age, the model pushed hard by all financial market fundamentalists. More than 90% of companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ are of this type. 85% of the FTSE, 75% of the Toronto Stock Exchange Index. Lo and behold, almost all the players in the financial meltdown of 2000, 2007, 2008 were companies of this type. All investment banks, the Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Morgan Stanley, had recently mutated from private partnership to exchange-listed corporation. All subprime mortgage originators, all the insurers, AIG, MBIA, the Freddie Mac, the Fannie Mae, and at least one rating agencies were all of that breed. How we have come to have an economic system dominated by this type of corporation is a story for another day, but it is legitimate to ask, for whose benefits should these companies be managed and governed? Are transient share flippers, speculators, and game players really the legitimate owners of publicly traded companies? In all decent societies, tourists don't vote, and gamblers don't own the casino. In a global free market, there is a variation of Gresham's law. Bad capitalism tends to drive out good capitalism. John Gray wrote that in Falls Down in 1999. Those of us who believe in the free economic system and capitalism must rise up and defend the system against those who will destroy it, and this time they're not Marxists. We need to bring about a renewed capitalism, one based on forms of business ownership and management compensation to foster and nurture a long-term perspective in the management of companies, some level of trust and loyalty within and around companies, and due consideration of the stakeholders that give companies their legitimacy and purpose. Edward Brenfield, a conservative sociologist, claimed the society should not be stratified according to birth, income, wealth, or education on the basis of people's time horizon. People with long time horizon, whatever the demographic are upper class. Well, over the last years, too many business corporations and their leaders, fund managers, shareholders, have become decidedly low class. Indeed, because of their ownership structure, organizations represented on this panel can manage for the long term. I believe we must spin the new web of business ownership and executive compensation, of laws and regulation, to bring out the better angel of our nature, to pursue what Jim Wallis calls the common good, the behaviors and value which make for a better society. I believe law precedes and generates value, which then become norms of behavior. The law must provide rules of the game for all in a level playing field. And I think there are many very specific actions to bring that about, and I know we'll get back to that in the second part of this panel.
Okay, very good, Yvan. Thank you. Thank you very much for that emphasis also on this whole notion of short-termism and the financial incentives that you believe breed that, and can we actually challenge that model? Jim, your perspective on this subject, please. Jim Wallis.
It was just last year at Davos, in a panel much like this one, that we said we must be asking the right questions in a crisis like this. And we said the wrong question was, when will the crisis end? As important as that is. The right question is, how will the crisis change us? So I think this discussion this morning is about, have we changed? How have we changed? And what still needs to change? As has been said, more and more of us believe that underneath the economic crisis, there's a values crisis, and we won't get to a true economic recovery unless that is accompanied and shaped by a moral recovery as well. So together we need to collectively shape, I would say, a moral compass for a new economy. Now, the high drama in my country of banks and bailouts and bonuses has been a bad morality play, if you will, and the citizenry is wanting to change the script. So right now, the massive bonuses in the face of massive economic suffering is causing a great political scandal in the U.S. But I would suggest, as Klaus Schwab said recently in the Wall Street Journal last week, the bonuses are only a symptom of a deeper erosion of societal values. There are new maxims which have overtaken us, like greed is good, it's all about me, and I want it now. Those maxims wreak havoc with economies, cultures, families, and our very souls. To counter those new maxims, I think we might return to some older, more spiritual virtues like enough is enough. We're in this together. And I love the ethic of native indigenous peoples. You evaluate decisions today by their impact on the seventh generation out. Now that would change things dramatically. So what are we learning? We're learning that relationships do matter between bankers and lenders, employers, customers, consumers. We're learning that social sins do find you out. Two of Gandhi's 7 deadly sins were wealth without work and commerce without morality. Finally, we're learning that really the common good is our own good. And when the invisible hand of the market lets go of the common good, economies spin out of control and societal bonds begin to fray. Bob Lane, my good friend, a CEO, says, the market is meant to be a means and not the end. So Adam Smith tells us that without a moral framework, the market can't function properly. Joseph Schumpeter says that when there is no ethical sensibility, the market ends up devouring every other sector and finally ends up devouring itself. That's what we've seen now. So I think we are indeed at a populist moment. It will either be a kind of dark populism, we've seen that before in history, anger, fear, blaming, resentment, or it will be a renewal of this notion of the common good, which is a religious ethic and a secular one, by leadership in all of our sectors. I'm a member of the Faith Council here at Davos, and we're asking how though religion has no monopoly on morality, how some of the ethics of our own faith traditions could be correctives here. And I think of old values like simplicity, stewardship, patience, humility, the radical assertion of the sacred value of every human life, and the longer-term metric of human flourishing, as opposed to the short-term metric of mere profitability. This is a structural crisis. It will require new social regulation and rules and accountability. But it's also a spiritual crisis that will call for new self-regulation for business leaders, for consumers, for parents, and for citizens. The crisis, I think, in conclusion, is an opportunity. I'm from Detroit. We launched this new book in Detroit, counterintuitive to launch a book in the worst book city in America right now, because nobody can afford books. But in my hometown of Detroit, there is massive suffering and pain. And if we go back to business as usual, all that pain will have been in vain. However, if this crisis is really an opportunity to, I would say, reset our values, restore the ethic of the common good, rebuild community, and redefine what I would call a new normal, then this great recession could be even redemptive on Wall Street, on Main Street, and on all of our streets. Thank you.
Jim, thank you. Thank you very much for that perspective and that whole notion of the values reset. I think a very, very interesting idea. Let's turn now to our CEOs. Let's start with the CEO perspective from Europe. Please, Hartmut, CEO of Bertelsmann.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished group of people for today's discussion. And my perspective is that of an entrepreneur. I lead an international family-owned company, and my views are shaped by a European-style social market economy. And if I think about key values, for me, trust is a key value. And I do believe that trust must be rebuilt on various levels. Trust has to be earned, and there are a few basic values that lead to earning trust. And these are time-honored virtues such as appropriateness, in the sense of appropriate action, reliability, so you have to say what you think and do what you say, and of course, responsibility. And these values, from my perspective, seem very basic, and they are basic. But it seems that many companies, business leaders, even entire countries, have forgotten or ignored these basic values. And by acting in line with these basic values, it instills trust. And an environment of trust fosters first growth, second sustainability, and third freedom. The very things that are very important and so important for our well-being. Values can create sustainable value, and I've experienced it by myself. Bertelsmann, the company I'm working for, is a value-driven organization with a strong corporate culture. And our culture is based on 4 values: entrepreneurship, partnership, creativity, and corporate responsibility. And this is our moral compass, as Jim Wallis calls it. Reinhard Mohn, our company's post-war founder, developed this culture. He first wrote it down in the 1960s. And those days, not many companies were thinking back about values then. And it worked. And this focus on values created for Bertelsmann a growth story, and it continues to do so as Bertelsmann will celebrate its 175th anniversary this year. Reinhard Mohn's thinking was very straightforward. He focused on people. He believed that every individual strive for self-fulfillment and that employees should be given the greatest possible freedom, and for this you need trust. He also believed in the idea of partnership. Owners, management, employees, suppliers, and customers, they should work together and not against each other. And for this, you need trust. And he felt that ownership comes with obligations, that successful companies should give back to society and the communities they are operating in. And that's what corporate responsibility is all about, having a sense of responsibility for the greater whole. That's what I leave. And having this sense of responsibility for the greater whole has always been a priority within our company. Our value-driven culture is very much alive today. It guides us as we strive for long-term sustainable development, and it has helped us to steer safely through this crisis. And it can be, from my perspective, act as a blueprint for a value-based approach, value-oriented leadership based on basic values that lead to an environment of trust. Thank you.
Hartmut, thank you very much. 175-year history and a values-based culture. It sounds like you're pretty optimistic about the next 175 as well.
Yeah, I will probably not see them, but...
Yeah, so how about the CEO perspective from Asia now? Japan, please.
By the way, our company has 228 years.
Hey, listen, you didn't realize how young Bertelsmann was,
I beat
did you?
him. Let me approach this subject from a different perspective. And it is my great pleasure to share some of my thoughts on the values we should move on from now. But first, I'd like to propose to the audience and the panelists that we'd better start learning the lessons being sent from our mother nature and also our history more seriously by viewing the much more bigger picture than each one is seeing in you guys' daily life. Lesson one I'd like to propose is nothing is perpetual. Everything in this whole universe is cyclical, including the whole universe itself. The universe started approximately 13.5 billion years ago with a Big Bang. And ever since then, it has been expanding, in last 13.5 billion years with literally astronomical speed. And this would be the longest interval cycle we know. However, it will eventually start shrinking and return to the origin of the universe. This is my interpretation, and you may have a difference in opinion. But on the other hand, there could be something in this universe cycling in nanosecond. So, but regardless of the interval, everything is cyclical. The fact of the matter is that nothing is perpetual, and also the ancient Chinese describe this in two simplistic words, yin and yang. Lesson two I'd like to propose is learn from the history. Hartmut, the home country, Germany. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of the Prussia, who united Germany in the late 18th century, or 19th century, said, fools learn only from their own experiences, while wise learn from others' experience, namely history as well. If we take a look at, for example, boom-bust history, as you can imagine, it's happening again and again and again. The very first documented bubble burst to the best of my knowledge, happened in the Netherlands in early 17th century, when tulip bulb bubble busted. I name it triple B. Ever since then, bubble burst occurred numerous times. Some study results revealed there are approximately 150 meltdowns ever since 1870. It's about 140 years ago. It means at least more than one meltdown per annum. But more serious problem is not only the size of the bubble burst becoming bigger and bigger, but also the interval getting shorter and shorter. So now is a time for us to do our best in transforming ourselves and our values and mindset from, several other panelists already said, short-term focused greed to long-term focused creed. That is my proposal. I'm sure we have high enough intelligence, including audience, to learn from the history and learn from the Mother Nature. But the question I'd like to impose to the audience and the panelists is, are we wise enough to to learn from those lessons and take those into our daily life as a checklist or a soundboard of our daily deeds?
Yashu, thank you. Thank you for that perspective.
Few
One more point? Go ahead, please.
Yeah. In my opinion, one of the hindering factors for us to learn lessons and practice it is that to human being, innate nature such as greed or groundless optimism or competitiveness, those are the traits human being as a Homo sapiens built in our gene during the course of the 150,000 years history. So it's going to be a very tough and uphill battle to transform our value from where we are so much used to the new era, but we have to. We have no choice but moving on. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yashu, thank you. Thank you very much. Tom, please, I know you lead a global company, the CEO of Thomson Reuters.
I wanted to come at it this morning from a slightly different tact and actually speak about only one value, a personal value, a value of personal responsibility. So I agree with much of what I've heard on the panel. I was taken by what Yvan led off by saying, in that you needed to be some sort of hero as an individual to act ethically in the face of all this great temptation. And I actually don't think that's the case. I think there are, both in business and in civil society and in governments, lots of individuals who don't approach heroic status, but nonetheless, through their daily lives, act ethically, do the right thing when faced with temptation. And I think we're letting individual responsibility off the hook a bit too easily as we rush to re-regulate, introduce new sort of large organizations to cure what's wrong with us. You know, recalling the words of President Kennedy, it is not just about asking what your nation can do for you, but what can the individual do? So let's take the banking crisis. A ton of proposals flying all over, obviously some very misaligned incentives and some cases of downright greed and corruption. But how about the individual responsibility? Many individual Americans filled out mortgage applications and affirmatively lied about their assets and about their income. Now, I don't care how much money somebody was making packaging up CDOs, no one forced that person to lie on a mortgage application. Number two, the America I moved back to from London, maybe while I was in Europe for 7 years, somebody passed a new amendment to the Constitution that each person has a constitutionally granted right to live in a house greater than he or she can afford. So while there are many things that are wrong systemically, I think we have a serious moral compass issue at the individual level. Let me give you another example. We run a very large legal information, legal research business. This cuts somewhat against my corporate interest, but the whole nature of products liability litigation is a bit out of control. If this morning I had woken up and bleary-eyed went into the shower and slipped, my first thought would be, I'm a clumsy moron, which would be pretty accurate, actually. My first thought would not be, oh, I should sue the Swiss manufacturer of this bathtub for not affixing a label warning me that it might be slippery if wet. So, I understand the issue that the whole system of values has been uprooted and placed end on end, but it ultimately comes down to individual moral actors making micro-level decisions. And I think there is a serious crisis in values at the individual level, which tends to get overlooked as we go for the somewhat deus ex machina answer of, oh, if we only had more regulation, oh, if we only had a better incentive system, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to put that out as a counter to the sort of top-down approach.
Tom, thank you. Thank you for that perspective also on the root cause analysis. I think the personal responsibility idea that once in fact that has failed and the moral discipline is not there, then the only thing you're left with is regulation and where that actually leads. And so trying to bring personal responsibility back, I think, is terrific. Your comments reminded me this WEF survey that I made reference to, 130,000 web-based responses. Do you think people apply the same values in their private lives as they do in their professional lives? And that question brought 22% yes, and 62% said no. And I think it takes you back to your point of how fundamental and how important the personal responsibility piece of this has to be in our discussion. Please, Mohammed, your point of view on this whole notion of values and in the wake of the Great Recession.
First, it's not only the Great Recession. I see it's a bundle of crises, not one crisis. It's the same period. It's a food crisis, it's the energy crisis, it's the global warming crisis, and the financial crisis. I mentioned this bundle because they are all, I think, rooted to the same cause. These are not different kind of isolated crises. They are manifestation of the same crisis. And all these crises emerge from the misinterpretation of human beings in the conceptual framework that we have built around us. That conceptual framework is at fault, and we are only expressing that failure of that conceptual framework in many different directions, many different ways. I would say this misinterpretation because the way human being is interpreted in this world, the way a capitalist system has been built around it, is a person who is driven by the profit motive. It's driven by only one purpose in life, to make money. As a result, we have created a one-dimensional human being, as opposed to the real human being, which is multidimensional. So we have squeezed a multidimensional person into a single-dimensional person who is now allowed to play to make money and make money, keep on making money, without realizing what does it mean. At the end, this becomes the means, making money becomes the means of life, and at the end, it becomes the end of your life. It doesn't make a meaningful conclusion to your life. So I said, if we can go back to the real human being, bring the real human being into the action, then all these problems will start solving itself. As a multidimensional being, I would say human being is selfish, and economists took this selfishness of human being and built a whole theory out of it. They didn't allow any other dimensions to play into the economic field. The same human being who is selfish, at the same time, he is selfless. This is no exception to any human being. You don't have to be a special person to be selfless. It is an essential ingredient of any human being. If that is so important, selflessness is so important, why don't we build business on the basis of selflessness too? So there will be two kinds of business, one based on selfishness, another based on selflessness. In a selfish business, everything is for me. I am the center of the world. So I squeeze everything, I bring everything towards me. In selfless business, I do business for others. Everything is for others, nothing for me. And I've been describing this business as a social business, sort of non-loss, non-dividend company with a social objective. The objective which is completely missing in the profit-maximizing businesses. It comes as a footnote, it comes as an afterthought, but not in the essential picture of the business itself. So if we include this selflessness alone, just forget about the other dimension, just alone another dimension, then you have a completely different structure. A world driven by profit motive and also simultaneously driven by selflessness. So we will express ourselves in two ways. One in a selfish way to make money for myself. At the same time, I address the problems I see around me. Each human being is endowed with enormous potential, unlimited potential. We are not using this total potential because we are so much focused on making money. If we had expressed ourselves in many directions, particularly in a selfless direction, then we'll bring this potential, this creativity in solving the problems that we have. Today, we have left all these problems in the hands of the government. Let government solve it. Let me keep myself busy making money. If they want tax, I'll pay tax, but don't disturb me. That's not a way. As a human being, I am capable of solving the problems that I see, and whenever I see a problem, I create a social business so that I can solve this problem. And we can varieties of this problem, particularly young people, if they knew that they can solve this problem, imagine how their creativity will come out and express themselves. Today, because of the structure that we built, all the technologies in the world, and technology is becoming more and more powerful each day, all the technologies of this world is in the hands of profit-making companies. And then we are trying to solve all the problems that we have created around us. And it's a very difficult task. If we could use this technology that we have in the hands of profit-making businesses by opening a window to the social business, and this technology can solve all the problems much faster than we ever thought. And the world will not be the kind of crisis after crisis handling and creating all the problems. So this is the issue that how do we interpret human being into our theoretical world, into our conceptual world. If you put the real human being in place, I think we can address all the issues much more satisfactorily.
Yunus, thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that point of view and that perspective and that whole idea of the selfless as well as the selfish individual. A very interesting perspective. Guys, let's see if we can just shift gears now and try to get to one of my favorite ways of expressing it is, and therefore we should. So if these are values that we need to see perhaps driven into the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we behave, how can we get about that? Who needs to do what to try to make this, frankly, much more descriptive of the world that we might one day describe? Ideas? Anybody want to jump in there? Please, Hartmut.
I mean, the current crisis is, from my perspective, certainly a crisis of leadership. And what we need to do is those of us who are a little bit privileged in the world, we need to act as a role model. And we should really act as true leaders who show authenticity, who show transparency, who show encourage and empathy. And this, for me, is very important.
Okay, good, very good. Leaders need to lead, and they need to lead in accordance with some kind of moral discipline in terms of how they act and how people actually see them. Jim, a point of view?
Yeah, it's important to recall that before the crisis, before this was named the crisis, 3 billion people in our globe were living on less than $2 a day. So the economic system and the values that are driving it were failing already half of humanity. Could this be a moment to bring those people in? I've been struck, a young senator told me his father was a coal miner in West Virginia. And you probably know the coal miners used to take canaries down with them into the mines, because the canary is a very sensitive respiratory system, and when the canary begins to choke and wheeze, it means the air has become toxic, and we'll all be in trouble soon if we don't scramble out of the mine. And I was struck how the canary is a metaphor for the poor in most of our religious traditions, because the idea is the poor become kind of a monitor, a kind of a standard by which we judge whether our air is becoming toxic, our culture, our environment. We haven't been listening to the canaries, if you will. So listening to the canaries, I think, becomes a crucial way forward. So it's not just sort of this social conscience as a sidebar over here, but what the most significant fact our Faith Council gap, the gap that we came up with, was these 3 billion people. And that becomes the biggest political fact in the global economy that we seldom talk about. So now talking about that conversation, I think, could be crucial for this crisis.
Interesting. Open up the dialogue, and then let's think in a much more inclusive way. How can we actually have the great growth and wealth creation much more broadly enjoyed? Interesting. Please, Yasu.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Muhammad said. I'd like to see more the positive side of the human being. I'm a firm believer of the good nature of the human being. In fact, in my opinion, 99.9%, I hate to say, I cannot say 100%, 9.9% of the people have a strong desire to contribute to the society, to make a better place to live, and also willing to reach out to the people who needs help or assistance. But many of the people are not aware of that part of the nature of the human being, because majority of them are preoccupied by their very busy day-to-day business, taking care. So one of the suggestions I'd like to make to the audience is create time in your very busy daily life, no matter how busy you are, to reflect upon yourself, such as meditation. Then once you do that, you begin to think about what kind of life you'd like to live, or what kind of person you'd like to be. Then automatically and naturally, you will become aware that you would like to help out other people out, and also reach out to the people. And also, to make this change more effective way, any person who is in the leadership position has to start by himself. Any change has to start all the way from the top, then trickle down to the organization. And to make that happen, leader needs to be very consistent in leading by example, by walking the talks, and not talking both sides of the mouth. That's what you guys need to do. Oftentimes, parents try to discipline children, but when they come out from the study room, parents are doing what they are not supposed to do. They told to the children. So you need to be a good example. Thank you.
Mohammed, please.
In the capitalist culture that we have grown with, we are fitted from our childhood with a glass of profit maximization. So we see the world through the profit maximization glasses. So any deviation somebody mentions, then you say, no, it doesn't fit into it, because we don't have any other glasses. So my proposal is, can we just take off those profit maximizing glasses for a moment and put on the social business glasses just for those few seconds? I bet you'll see the world completely differently, and you'll be excited about it, that you can play a role in it, that yes, you have the capacity to change the problem, change the world the way you want it world to be. We started creating those instances, kind of taking off that profit maximizing glasses, putting on that social business glasses, and created companies. And many companies, seeing our results, became excited about it. Some of them came up forward to have joint venture with us. And Grameen Danone is an example where we produce yogurt in Bangladesh as a social business, because Bangladeshi children, but half the children of Bangladesh are malnourished. So what we're doing, we're putting all the micronutrients which are missing in the children into this yogurt, which we make through a social business. And if a child eats 2 cups of this yogurt, within a week and continues to do so for 8 to 9 months, the child regains all the micronutrients which they were missing and becomes a healthy child and a playful child. So this is a social business because investors, both of us, Grameen and Danone, agreed we'll never take any dividend out of it because the whole business is done for the sake of reducing and eliminating malnutrition among the children. So we ask our CEO at the end of the year, how many children got out of malnutrition? Rather than a profit-maximizing company where you'll be asking your CEO how much money we made. And then it goes from there. So we created other companies like Water Company to bring very good quality water in the villages in a very cheap price so that everybody can afford it. They don't have to drink the arsenic-contaminated water in Bangladesh, which is a huge, big problem in Bangladesh. And we are now having a joint venture with Adidas to produce shoes affordable to the poorest person. And the idea is of this shoe, and they have agreed now, we are joint venture as a social business, again, not for making any money, but for producing these shoes, because many of our diseases are attack body through the skin of the feet. So if you do not cover the feet, you get into the parasitic diseases. And many of the hookworm around the world is because of that. So if we can produce attractive shoes for everybody at a very, very inexpensive way, you protect people from all these kinds of diseases as a social business. So you name every single, in healthcare, in education, in training, in bringing information technology, in bringing financial services, in a social business, the world will be so different. All we need to do, just for a while, just for a few seconds, take off that profit-maximizing glasses and put on the social business glasses.
And if we took that seriously, rather than if we did a show of hands, how many of you are for values? Probably all raise your hands, or for a more moral economy. But this notion of a metric, let's call it what it takes to build a common good economy, which I would suggest is smarter as well as more moral. But what does that metric look like, a common good economy? That begins to aim at this populism where I learned last week in the U.S., if you want a very quick and huge applause line on a TV show, just say, I think the bank bonuses should all be sent to Haiti, and everyone cheers, you know. So there's this moment out there hungry for a new kind of leadership. And I think this notion of rebuilding what a common good economy looks like could be a metric for implementing the values conversation.
Mohammed, just going back to your social business, how does that business sustain itself, and where does it obtain the capital to get started? I understand where you'd find the moral energy to initiate it, but where does the capital come from, and then how does that social business sustain itself?
Just on the capital side, start from the foundation. If a foundation gives away money as a charity, so you achieve certain goal with that charity, but the charity money is a one-time money. It goes, achieves the goal, never comes back. But if you can transform this whole objective, whatever your objective was, the health or whatever, it is business format. So you invest the same money as a social business. Then the social business money recycles. Like in the case of Danone case, Grameen Danone case, yogurt, we sell the yogurt. It's not a free distribution. It covers the cost. When it's a social business, your cost of production goes way down because many of the frills that you have in a profit-making companies as fancy container, fancy advertisement, all these are gone, finished. You go to the essence and you bring it down to the basic cost of it. And then you sell, people buy it, and you recover your cost. Because essential factor of a social business, it has to be a business. You can even make profit. You make profit, nobody takes profit. That is the difference. I'm not creating the company for taking profit, but the company makes profit to expand and so on. So this is one source. And now new sources coming up. Many are taking initiative to create social business fund so that I put money, not for making money, but support the social businesses as venture capital, as equity participation, or even lending money to the social businesses. So source, and I was talking about creating stock market, social stock market, because this stock market is about making money. I go there to getting myself rich overnight. So social business doesn't have a chance there. So why don't we create a social business, social stock market? So that I go there to transform the life of a poor woman, or I transform the life of 6 children around the world, And I like this company, and I invest in this company because I want to help them as an investment, not as a charity, because I'm entitled to get back my money, but no dividend. I don't expect dividend. I want to see results are coming out, and I'm happy about it. And I kind of run to support more and more of these things, companies which are working well. So it's a restructuring of the entire parallel economy. It's the same thing, stock market, and you need publications too. Now you have Wall Street Journal to tell you what's going on in the stock market, or Financial Times, or such other. You will be having very soon Social Wall Street Journal, or Social Financial Times, telling you which company is transforming the world, and you would like to see that I'm involved in it. I want to do something. As a child, you grow up. What you do as you grow up? What would you do when you finish school? Are you going to get a job in a profit-making company, or you want to take a job in a social business? So you have an option. People grow up with that kind of thing. So the whole series of things can be developed.
Very good. Thank you. Yvan, please.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. I think we did underestimate the great social and economic potential of cooperatives. They've played an important role in Canada. They play an important role. But I'm concerned with the fact that more than 90% of companies on the New York Stock Exchange and the UK and so on are owned, quote unquote, owned by fund managers who want profit and want quick profit, want quarterly growth in earnings. And these companies, as I said, they're not represented here. We should have more companies that are kind represented here, kind of ownership that we have represented on this panel. We should foster that. We should increase that, because these companies have the ability to foster the kind of values, long-term perspective, having other goals than strictly the short-term profit maximization of the companies. But we still have this huge number of companies out there that if we leave it as it is, I don't see how, if we don't change anything, I don't see how they will move to different kind of ethos, a different kind of approach to the business, because they are pushed by a particular set of incentive, of pressure, of motives. We've arranged a compensation to align them on that. And yes, they have to be quite heroic to sustain, to resist that, or they can walk away, which is already an heroic gesture, just walk away from it. But if you do walk away, somebody else is going to take your place. And a lot of people are prepared to do that. So how do we deal with this huge number of companies, which are the ones who are fighting? I'm sure many people want to move away from that system, but they don't know how we do it. And I think that's why I believe there is some call for different ways of defining governance, the rights of shareholders, and so on. And I want to get into that, but I think that's where we have to look at.
Okay, Hartmut and then Tom, please. And then I'm going to, after their comments, I'm going to come to the audience to see if you have any questions for our panel. But please, Hartmut and then Tom.
Yeah, let me do one remark. We talk about profit-driven and social business. In Germany, we have an expression, and this expression is social market economy. And all the success of the German economy has been built in the 50s, 60s on this social market economy. What I want to say is it's not important to have a short-term approach. It is important to have a long-term approach to everything, which gives us terms of sustainability. And this sustainability, we need in 3 dimensions. First dimension is economic sustainability. Second is ecologic sustainability. It's very important. We mentioned that we wouldn't talk about today, but it's important. And third is social sustainability. And if we will be all able to manage these 3 dimensions, then we will be able to successfully further develop the greater good for all of us.
Hartmut, thank you. Tom, please.
I was just struck as we're beginning to form positions around the panel that you had cautioned us not to tackle the enormous subject of, let's say, climate change coming out of Copenhagen, but we seem to have backed into a even larger issue, which is, do we believe in for-profit capitalism, or should we, in effect, replace for-profit corporations with some form of cooperative social organization? I guess I come from a more free market perspective. I don't think that it's incompatible to have alongside profit-making companies, cooperatives, universities, which are not for profit. My worry, and maybe it's a worry about human nature, ends up being I've seen a lot of companies and organizations that don't count things. And when they don't count, they don't allocate properly. And when they don't allocate, they get fat, they get sloppy. It is exactly the opposite of the remarkable success that Muhammad Yunus has had, because he is talking about an accounting for the people fed or the people whose jobs have been created. But, it's a bit like is sometimes said about democracy. It's not perfect, but it's the best system we have. And just back to Yvan's point, I now have a 55% shareholder, but we're publicly listed. We have over a $10 billion public float. I've also worked earlier in a company that was widely held and had no holder greater than 10%. I haven't changed a bit. Yes, there's a short-term perspective because time value of money matters in capital formation. But if you can explain a plan, and I've had I have gone to the market and disappointed people and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you the margin you want this quarter or this year. But if you, in effect, re-up with me, this is what I'm going to give you in 3 or 4 years. And you then, damn well better deliver against it. But you can actually take longer-term investment market perspectives. Shipping companies do it every day. Energy companies, like some in the room today, do 20-year projects. And they're not told, no, don't do that because we want the return this week. So I guess I'm speaking up for the potential, at least, to maintain profit-making as one of the engines to make the pie larger for all of us.
You won't get any debate on that from me. I'm certainly a capitalist, and I think what I'm hearing is what we need to do is rebalance our perspectives, not replace. But
it's not replace. That's the point I was making. I'm not suggesting replace. I said you need one more so that it's balanced. Today there is no balance. So it will be parallel. It's an option. If anybody wants to take that window, welcome. If not, go ahead what you do. But that option doesn't exist today. We cannot express ourselves. It is inside of us, but we cannot express because this architecture doesn't allow us.
And even Yvan, in the majority option, we've got to move away from merely a focus on shareholders and talk about multiple stakeholders. Because multiple stakeholders is not just a utopian notion, it's reality. Customers and workers and consumers, the environment itself, the 7th generation out is a stakeholder on decisions made today. So we have so focused on profitability as opposed to even corporations as purposeful organizations, not just profitable. We've gone so far down the road on individual to the point of narcissism. This late-night comedian in the U.S. was doing a TV show, and he said, I'm on an airplane, and the stewardess says, we now have internet online on the plane, but it's broken today. And the guy next to me says, darn. He's mad about something he didn't know existed 10 seconds ago, So we've gone so far down that line that if we keep going down that way, there's consequences of social unraveling here. A populist moment is upon us. It's going to either be angry and resentful and destructive, or it's going to be an impetus, an impulse for the kind of visionary populism we see in Martin King and civil rights, but that could be a citizens' movement around a stakeholder notion as opposed to a narrowly focused, short-term shareholder notion, even in the larger option, I hope.
okay, to the audience, please, 4 questions in the back. Wait for the microphone if you would.
Shall we say, the media to communicate trying to instill personal values. My specific question to both of you is this. Is it at a time when, this is not post-crisis for media, as you well know. This is a continuing crisis and so on. You are, I think, unusual in the media industry, globally. There are many corporations involved in media who do not share the sort of values that you've talked about. How do we and how do you, I know you have foundations, both of you, which do a great job, but how do you take the sort of value-based culture that you've got and are trying to develop and extend it within a sector where there is a desperate need for a realignment of values to try to connect with citizens in a way which will bring about real change?
Guys, to our media leaders, how do you use the muscle of media to help drive this whole idea of a values-based approach to management and leadership and frankly, society? Hartmut first and then Tom.
We talk about values, and we talk about one of the most important values I mentioned was freedom. And of course, heading a media company, press freedom is something we have to secure and we have to be very, very work hard with. And I have to say, and you all have to be aware, that 2/3 of the worldwide population do not have press freedom in their countries. And what we should all take as given, as a normalism in press freedom, we should need to fight for. And this is one of the basic values I mentioned we need to continue and focus on. And if we talk about the future of journalism, I'm by far more optimistic on the future of media and the future of journalism than all the journalists themselves are. What you see and what you experience today is that there's a little bit of shortcutting of costs, and there's on the other hand much more time, much other things, more digitalization in the businesses, and all the processes of doing journalism has to be restructured. And we should not argue that out of this, the journalism is dead. Journalism is alive, will be alive, and we need journalism to be alive also in the future.
Tom, please.
I mean, when we think about it, we really think about two issues. One, how do you protect first physically journalists because they are at risk? We lost 6 journalists covering the wars in Iraq. And second, how do you protect press freedoms? And then second, how do you pay for it? So quickly on the first issue, at Reuters and now at Thomson Reuters, we've not only put up a nice mission statement on the wall that talks about independence, freedom from bias, accuracy of our news, we've enshrined it into the organizational documents of a public corporation. We have a sort of super board called the Founder Share Company that sits on top of the company and whose sole mission is essentially to protect the integrity of editorial. I've got lots of freedom of action with 53,000 employees in the company. The one thing I can and never do is tell the editor-in-chief, who's probably in the room, what he should or shouldn't do. And that's why I think our news file is protected. We don't need to sort of censor in China and then uncensor in China. We never censor in China or anywhere else, and at times that is difficult economically. Now, on to the second question, how do you pay for it? We have a little bit of a free ride. Although Reuters is well known for the news agency, actually the media business is our smallest business, and we, in effect, monetize our editorial and other information by selling content and tools to professionals who need it in turn to do their jobs. I am not at all pessimistic like Hartmut for journalism. I think we got to get over the issue that newspapers equal journalism. And we've been hiring. We've added over 100 journalists in the last year or so, and we'll continue to hire into editorial. The issue is I wouldn't try today to launch a newspaper other than in particular rapidly developing economies.
Mohammed, one comment, and then I'm going to come back to the audience.
Yeah, just to mention that the power that the media wields, I feel very nervous. I see the risk that this media is owned by some profit-maximizing people. and we leave all this editing and screening at their hands. And ideally, I think media should be a social business. It's not for making money, it's for good of the world. That's the area I think media belongs to.
Other questions, please? Right here in the back with the hand up, and then I'll come over here next.
I'm a rabbi from the Netherlands. I cannot. I have to start with the fact that this is also Holocaust Day. That means that all over the world we commemorate one of the grievances and one of the pain that was caused. I myself was saved by a selfless action of a German woman who made the difference between life and death. I'm here because of her. And I very much agree with Mohammed Yunus about the selflessness part of the human being. And I agree that even in our religious sphere, we have not always acted compassionately towards each other. And we are moving now towards a interreligious, intercultural cooperation. It's not easy, but it comes about. And this is necessary to nurture that selflessness, that compassionate part of the human being. And I'm asking business community, it is very difficult between competition and cooperation and a profit. But at the same time, there is this chance in this realization of the failures of the past to come also to a sense of doing business in a compassionate way, in rising above the competition to seeing ways in which there can be cooperation to reach out. And we have heard about sustainability, about the necessity of safeguarding the seventh generation. And we know that in some way, those 3 billion people have to live, not only survive, but live a happy life. So what is emerging out of this crisis in this cooperation amongst those whose business it was to make profit, but realize now social responsibility as the core of selflessness that is in us?
Yasha, do you want to just comment on that point? And then I'm going to move to our last question here. But anything that you want to add to the point that was just made? As a business leader, how you actually bring that so-called selfless dimension of people out and help them realize that?
Yeah, people tend to think things in a black and white way. But based on my experience in the business, almost 40 years, there is always a way to find out somewhere in between. Sometimes you guys name this as a win-win situation. Let me give you one of the examples. For example, AIDS treatment agent in developing countries such as South Africa, Brazil, don't have the ability to manufacture the AIDS treatment agent by themselves. So ask the advanced countries to supply the AIDS treatment agent. But they are very much reluctant because of the boomerang effect to re-import it to the advanced countries if they provide those products at a very low cost. But there is always a way by asking manufacturers to manufacture the products with different color and the different code and the different shape of the tablets or something like that to each specific nation. So if you can use your creativity and imagination in a proper way, we will always be able to find out a way to mutually satisfactory solution. That is my belief.
Ashu, thank you. Please, right back here.
I'm Jim Rogers with Duke Energy, and I'm going to make a comment. It's going to be provocative, but I'd like to hear the response from the panel on this. Because as I listen, and having been a CEO for 21 years who has run his business based on a multiple stakeholder approach the entire time, the comment by Tom really resonated with me. Yes, there's been some bad actors, but I get a sense of two things from this discussion. One is the implication that there are no values in business today, or they need to be fundamentally altered. I also get a sense from the discussion that, and that really missed the point, that the vast majority of companies, and I can speak only for the United States, have leaders who are authentic, who are real, who are good role models, who every day deliver for all their stakeholders. And I would say further, if you look at philanthropy from corporations, from individuals, in the US, a country where there's probably more for-profit corporate entities than any country in the world, China will be on that road soon. But the reality is the per capita giving and the giving per corporations leads the world. I mean, look at the Gates Foundation. But for Microsoft and a for-profit approach, the Gates Foundation wouldn't exist today. That's Exhibit A. But there are hundreds, thousands of foundations throughout the United States that corporations like ours and others have formed and are supporting other issues in the community. And so in a sense, I find this conversation takes us in a direction that really undermines the good work that is now being done, doesn't recognize, as Tom posed the question, that for-profit corporations at the end of the day really deliver. And I would dare say that virtually every major corporation in America uses a stakeholder approach. And I would dare say the statistics with respect to giving lead the world. Much of the world turns to the government to do for what in the United States private individuals, foundations, and corporations do. I would like a comment on that thought.
Jim, thank you. Thank you very much for that point of view and also for the passion with respect to what you believe is the fundamental fabric that perhaps you feel we haven't included or woven into this discussion as we use the word crisis and attach it to values. But anyone want to comment on Jim's point? Mohammed first and then Jim Wallis.
I had no dispute on whatever you said. I'm only saying all this money, which are foundations like Microsoft, Bill Gates Foundation, and so on, the trillions of dollars in donations, could be used much better in social business investments so that you create institutions, you create technology for that. And in the process, even if you have created one good example, a seed, which can be multiplied all over, and it remains, it continues. But in a charity, it goes, it does the job, never comes back. So every year you're pushing the same thing. It will be adding up. So that part I'm adding to this. And same CEO who is so dedicated, so well-meaning, and gives a good leadership, if you give him a new task, create a company to create 10 jobs only. You don't have to make profit out of it for yourself or stakeholders. You use it to redo it again and again. You'll be delighted to do it because now he's not bound by making a 15% return on investment or whatever return you wanted to do because that's not his goal. Goal is to create 10 jobs. And he does a beautiful work with creating 10 jobs. If this can be done, and this can be repeated 100 times, 1,000 times, we have solved the unemployment problem as a social business. That's the point I was making.
I think we make a mistake if we see this values question as a matter of good people and bad people. I think that's a mistake. Rather, that we haven't been paying attention. We're in a crisis now because we haven't been paying attention to a number of values that we do indeed hold, but we're in a crisis. And we should understand that this crisis is felt at a very grassroots level. And where I live, Washington, D.C., is wired to block change. And I would suspect Wall Street is too. But around the country, there are real social movements now around the world on issues like trafficking. That's becoming a social movement. Or this whole issue of money, there's a movement afoot because of the behavior of the largest banks in the U.S. to move money. There's a new website, there's a movement growing, and here's what they're saying. If these banks are too big to fail, let's make them smaller. by moving our money to local banks, community banks. So there's activity going on around the country, and it's not good and bad people. It's let's pay attention to things that we somehow let go of or let become marginal and bring those back to what it means, again, to build together a moral compass for a new economy.
We're out of time, but Yvan, just one last comment.
Yeah, I think we gave the wrong impression if we're against profit. I mean, obviously, the whole point is the quest for long-term profit, by definition, forces you to look at multiple stakeholders, look at other considerations, other aspects of the business. It's a short-term maximization of profit that we're against. I think that was the point we're trying to make, some of us.
Okay, let me just, I know there are other questions that you'd like to try to get into the discussion, but we are out of time and we need to respect those who've planned and all of your also respective agendas and the commitments you've made. And so if I were to try to sum up this last 75 minutes, and I'm not sure that I can, but if I was to attempt to sum it up, I would say what we need to do is try to rebalance the message that we are actually understanding and gleaning. And I like very much the point that Mohammed has made that inside each of us, perhaps we sometimes focus too much on this notion of selfishness and the greed that perhaps we think that breeds. But can we find that selfless piece of us, and can that become part of who we are as we take Tom Glocer's challenge of personal responsibility to all dimensions of our life, in whatever role we're playing, and with that personal responsibility and then that whole notion of selflessness, I think the common good and that movement from greed to creed and the other points that have been made by our panelists, I think can be something we can celebrate and will celebrate. And I agree with Jim Rogers' point. There's much to celebrate in terms of what's happening out there, and I believe our capitalist society actually has the potential to become the vehicle to deal with many of the social issues that Mohammed has also highlighted. So to our panelists, thank you very much, and to our audience, thank you for engaging with us.
Very good.